The title of this video, Gilded Age Politics and Reform, is somewhat of an oxymoron because the Gilded Age politicians didn't really reform much. What are we going to talk about? The federal government, especially, had fully embraced the laissez-faire approach to the economy during the Gilded Age. Let the rich dudes integrate their businesses vertically, horizontally, diagonally, whatever, and the economy will grow. And it's true that the overall economy did grow exponentially during this era, but of course, as we explored last episode, this rising tide did not lift all boats. Inequality was rampant, as most of the wealth was concentrated in the hands of a few. And again, when the government did get involved in economic issues, they mostly sided with business interests. For example, when the Pullman strike disrupted the railroad industry, the federal government issued an injunction and brought in the National Guard. They justified ordering the strike to end because it was disrupting the Postal Service, which was a federal organization. Now, in exchange, they declared Labor Day a national holiday. It's like every time a group of people are being oppressed, the federal government is just like, well, declaring a national holiday is a lot cheaper than actually fixing the problem. In some ways, it makes sense that the government would side with big business because business is booming, and that's good for the overall economy, sure. But it's also because politics were super corrupt in the Gilded Age. Of course, not every politician was corrupt, obviously, but enough were, taking bribes, using their office to make money, controlling elections, shutting down strikes or investigations that might slow business, that the corrupt politician became a symbol of this era, and no one epitomizes Gilded Age politics like William Boss Tweed. You know this guy. I guarantee that your US history teacher showed you cartoons of this guy in high school. Boss Tweed was the leader of the Tammany Hall political organization that basically ran New York City in the late 1800s. So-called political machines dominated local politics, hand-picking nominees, pressuring voters, and reaping the rewards of having their guys well-positioned around the city. Boss Tweed used his connections to defraud New York City out of up to $200 million. And Tammany Hall had their supporters, especially the growing immigrant population that was often protected and supported by Tweed's operation. But everyone knew that he was corrupt. He lived in a mansion on Fifth Avenue and had a massive diamond sewn into his shirt, like he wasn't subtle. And then along comes the hero of the day, the cartoonist. A German immigrant named Thomas Nast started drawing cartoons of the most powerful man in New York City to bring him down. And it worked? Published in Harper's magazine, Nast drew Boss Tweed as a fat dirtbag, above the law, stealing votes, or with a money bag for a head. You know, political cartoon stuff. And even though investigative journalists had been writing scathing articles about Tweed in the New York Times, these cartoons hit Tweed where they hurt, his constituents. Boss Tweed himself complained, "My constituents don't know how to read, but they can't help seeing them damned pictures." Art as resistance is hella effective. Now, Boss Tweed tried to get Nast out of the country by offering him a fake opportunity to study art in Europe. He offered to pay him $100,000 to leave for Europe. But Nast was onto him and he dragged his feet. It wasn't until Tweed upped his offer to $500,000 that Nast was like, nah, I'm just messing with you. I'm not going anywhere. I love this guy. Tweed pulled a Karen and then went straight to Nast's boss. Tammany Hall threatened to have their guys in the Board of Elections boycott Harper's textbooks in city schools, which was a huge financial loss for the company. But Harper stuck with their cartoonist and didn't give in. Yes, a company supporting one of their lowly employees. How refreshing. Over time, Thomas Nast's cartoons worked. The 1871 election saw many of the Tammany men voted out of office. With less influence and protection from the local government, charges were filed against Tweed and his allies. He was sent to prison for fraud, forgery, and larceny. The state also sued him for $6 million, and he was put in debtor's jail until he could put up half of his bail. While in jail, he was allowed daily trips outside to see his family, accompanied by a jailer. And of course, on one of these trips, he escaped and fled to Spain. Man, it was so easy to commit crimes if you were a white dude in the 19th century. Any century. But here's the best part of the story. Boss Tweed was a fugitive in Spain for a year, working as a sailor on a Spanish ship, until a Spanish officer discovered him. He was like, "You look really familiar." And how did he know what Tweed looked like? He'd seen Nast cartoons, of course. Ah, sweet justice. Tweed was brought back and died in debtor's prison 3 years later in 1878. One other event from the Gilded Age also typifies the problem with corruption in government at the time. In 1881, just 4 months into his presidency, former Union General President James Garfield was shot at a train station. Now, we know in hindsight that the shooting actually wasn't fatal. The bullet had missed his arteries and vital organs, but doctors at the time weren't great at their job always. They just didn't know what we know now, and so they used unsterilized instruments and their bare hands to dig around trying to get the bullet out. Garfield spent months in the hospital being administered quinine, morphine, and alcohol. His doctor kept trying to get the second bullet out, but he couldn't find it. He even called in a guy named Alexander Graham Bell, the inventor of the telephone, to use a crude metal detector to try to find it. Anyway, all of this poking and prodding led to infections, because of course it did, and a persistent fever, and Garfield died in September 1881 after being president for just 200 days, most of those on his deathbed. Why was he assassinated? Well, his assassin Charles Guiteau was mad that he hadn't gotten a job. The 39-year-old had been a supporter of Garfield's during the election, but not like a helpful supporter. Like, he didn't donate a bunch of money or work for the campaign. No, Guiteau was a drifter who had spent some time at a free love religious commune. He moved from city to city, one step ahead of his debt collectors. He published a book on theology that turned out to be entirely plagiarized. His own father believed that Guiteau was possessed by Satan, but Charles believed he was the next Paul, empowered by God to preach a new gospel. His God complex was helped along by him surviving a shipwreck. I mean, everyone else survived too, but still, he interpreted it as being specifically saved by God. Feeling like he didn't have any power in the world of plagiarized theology, he turned to politics. He wrote a speech in favor of President Grant as the Republican nominee called Grant Against Hancock. Then, when James Garfield won the nomination instead, he just did a Control F and replaced Grant with Garfield. Actually, he used the exact same speech. He gave the speech twice and had it printed and passed around at the Republican National Convention. And when Garfield was elected president, Guiteau was like, "You're welcome." So when Garfield entered office and started hiring all of his buddies and people who'd helped get him elected, "Oh, hey, Andrew Jackson spoils system, not glad to see you're still around," Guiteau was anxiously waiting for his letter to arrive, announcing that he'd been named secretary of something, I don't know, raving madmen? No, actually what he did was he moved to Washington, D.C., found a way to meet with the president, handed him a copy of his speech, and then asked Garfield outright for control of the American consulate in Paris. Go big or go home. And when he didn't get it, he did what we all do when we don't get a job we want. He stalked and murdered the President of the United States. Guiteau even hand-picked an ivory-handled pistol for the assassination because he thought it would look nice in a museum one day. Like, for real. God, this guy had such horribly misguided flair. So yeah, his guilt was clear, although he did make an interesting argument when he said, quote, "I deny the killing but admit the shooting," meaning, yeah, I shot the president, but his doctors killed him. Almost 1 year to the day after he shot the president, Charles Guiteau was executed by hanging. And what about the beautiful pistol, you might be wondering? It was given to the Smithsonian, who then lost it. That sounds about right. Anyway, why are we talking about this? Well, it's because this was a wake-up call that maybe promising government jobs to your supporters isn't the most stable way to build a federal government bureaucracy. Since Jacksonian days, it was common practice to give out jobs as political patronage, but a lot of people started to agree that a president getting killed over it wasn't ideal. Less than 2 years after Garfield's death, his successor, Chester Arthur, great name, passed the Pendleton Civil Service Reform. This law mandated that a lot of positions in the federal government should be given out based on merit. What a concept. Some government employees would be selected by competitive exams, qualifying them for service. Hello, Confucian bureaucracy. It took us 2,000 years longer than y'all to figure it out, but we did it. The Gilded Age was dark for most people, and most people felt powerless. But by the end of the 19th century, voices asking for change were getting louder. Politically, a tidal wave of populism spread across the heartland. Farmers, who especially felt left behind by urban politicians and were getting screwed over with high rates from robber barons, they formed their own political movement and the Populist Party. They gained enough influence that the Democrats, led by William Jennings Bryan, actually ended up adopting a lot of their platform, increasing silver as currency to reduce inflation, a graduated income tax, and direct election of senators. Some of the more radical populist ideas, like government ownership of the railroad industry, got left behind. But the government did start to step up in very small increments. Beyond the Civil Service Act, they also established the ICC to regulate the railroad industry, and they passed the Sherman Antitrust Act to prevent massive monopolies. Now, some of this legislation is actually going to be huge later on. Like, the ICC is literally the first time the federal government gave itself direct control over an economic issue. They could set railroad rates, which would have a huge impact on basically every other aspect of the economy as well. Now, did the government follow through and enforce these laws? Not really, but baby steps, I guess. And the populist movement and the activities of people like Jacob Riis and Thomas Nast are also just a preview of the next era in American history. Because while the Gilded Age saw insane economic growth and the rise of the 1%, most people had been left behind. By 1900, Americans wanted to see more than just economic development. They wanted social progress. Oh man, I can't wait to talk to y'all about the progressive era. Thanks for watching. Like and subscribe and join patreon.com/antisocialstudies.